Ladies and gentlemen, welcome again to the Sun Hung K Properties Nobel Laureates Distinguished Lectures. The lecture series is jointly presented by the Sun Hung K Properties and the Chinese University of Hong Kong, generously made possible by the Sun Hung K Properties. Today, we are greatly honored to have invited Professor Kenneth J. Arrow to deliver a lecture on our university campus. First of all, may I have the honor to invite our distinguished guests to come on stage. Professor Kenneth Arrow, 1972 Nobel Laureate in Economic Sciences. Mr. Michael Wong, Executive Director of the Sun Hung K Properties. Professor Lawrence Lau, Vice Chancellor and President of the Chinese University. May I first invite Professor Lawrence Lau to deliver an address. Professor Lau, please.
Professor Kenneth Arrow, Mr. Michael Wong, distinguished guests, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon to you all. It is my great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Chinese University of Hong Kong to the Sun Hung K Properties Nobel Laureates Distinguished Lecture by Professor Kenneth Arrow, the co-recipient of the 1972 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. This lecture series was inaugurated in 2004 and is celebrating its 5th anniversary this year. Close to 20 Nobel laureates in different fields have, at our invitation, delivered public lectures here in Hong Kong over the past 5 years, offering our faculty, students, and members of the general public a sumptuous feast of food for thought. Their distinguished accomplishments, passion for knowledge, breadth of vision, and deep concern for humanity have invigorated our intellectual community and inspired people from all walks of life to strive for excellence. By hosting these lectures, we hope to encourage the discovery and dissemination of knowledge and demonstrate the university's strong commitment to serving Hong Kong and the world of learning as a whole. Today, we are most honored and privileged to have with us Professor Kenneth Arrow, who will speak to us on economic analysis and social obligation. Born in New York City in 1921, Professor Arrow received his bachelor's degree from the City College of New York at the time. In 1940, his MA in mathematics and PhD in economics from Columbia University in 1941 and 1951, respectively. He began teaching economics at the University of Chicago in 1948. A year later, he joined the faculty of Stanford University when he became Professor of Economics, Statistics, and Operations Research. He then moved to Harvard University as Professor of Economics in 1968 and worked there until 1979, when he came home to Stanford as John Kenny Professor of Economics and Professor of Operations Research. He retired from Stanford in 1991 and has been Professor Emeritus at Stanford ever since. For his pioneering contributions to general economic equilibrium theory and welfare theory, Professor Arrow was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences in 1972, jointly with Professor Sir John Hicks of Oxford University. A most distinguished economist, Professor Arrow has been conferred many other honors and awards, including the United States National Medal of Science, the John Bates Clark Medal, the von Neumann Prize, as well as 25 honorary doctorates by prestigious universities around the world. He has been president of the Econometric Society, the Institute of Management Sciences, the American Economic Association, and the International Economic Association. And I think he's also the founding president of Economists for Peace and Security. Right. Professor Arrow is one of the most listened to of all practicing economists in the last half century. The impact of his scholarly work has been enormous. 4 of his students, his former students, have been awarded the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences. They are John Hassani, A. Michael Spence, Eric Maskin, and Roger Myerson. On behalf of the Chinese University, I would like to express our utmost gratitude to Professor Arrow for coming all the way to visit the Chinese University and share with us his wisdom and scholarly insight. This is actually the second time he has lectured at Chinese University, Hong Kong. 15 years ago, Professor Arrow was here, and I think that the Professor Liu Pak Wei at the time also entertained and received him. I also want to add that Professor Arrow is a former colleague of mine and a mentor and a friend. I first met him in 1966, when I came back to Stanford as an acting assistant professor. And in all these years, I have greatly benefited from Professor Arrow's wisdom. I've always found it telling my friends that Professor Arrow is absolutely the smartest person I've ever known. I would also like to take this opportunity to reiterate our grateful thanks to Sun Hung Kai Properties, represented here by Mr. Michael Wong today, for their most generous sponsorship for this project. The lecture series would not have been possible without their staunch support. Ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you once again for coming. Let me also greet all those who are watching the live broadcast of this event in China and elsewhere. In order that more can benefit from the wisdom and scholarship of Professor Arrow, this lecture will be broadcast to our sister institutions in Hong Kong and also to leading universities in the mainland, including Peking University and Tsinghua University. So I wish there are literally thousands of people listening to this particular lecture. I wish all of you a most stimulating and productive time ahead. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Lau. It is indeed our great honor to have invited Professor Arrow to come to Hong Kong. To show our appreciation, may I invite Mr. Michael Wong, Executive Director of Sun Hung Kai Properties, to present a souvenir to Professor Arrow. Gentlemen, please. On this memorable occasion, may I also invite Professor Lawrence Lau to join in for a group photo. Thank you, gentlemen. Would Mr. Wong and Professor Lau please take a seat in the audience? Without further ado, let us welcome Professor Arrow to deliver his lecture on Economic Analysis and Social Obligation. Professor Arrow, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here at the Chinese University of Hong Kong again. As remarked, I was here participate in the celebration of the 30th anniversary of the university. It was my pleasure to give a lecture at that time on a more contemporary sort of affair that I'm going to discuss today. It was more a comment on the events of the day, which were especially the change in the nature of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union still existed at this point, but the question of the effects of a changing economic regime on a very large economy, and which had been organized under very different principles, and what the effects were likely to be. Today, my thesis is a little more philosophical. I hope it's not too abstract. I'm not going to discuss the events of the day, which are a lot more dramatic than they were when I accepted the invitation. And I have actually given a couple of talks on it already on this trip. No, I'm really concerned with a matter which in some way has really preoccupied myself, in one form or another has preoccupied me since the beginning of my career as an economist. In fact, it appears already in my doctoral dissertation, but in a very different form than I'm going to speak today. And of course, it has been the preoccupation of economists for many, many years before I was born, which is a long time ago. The thesis is that perhaps I shouldn't even say it's a thesis, it's rather an examination of a question. I'm not going to come up with any very definitive answers. I rather am going to raise some questions, and I hope that this is not unsatisfactory to an audience which may sometimes be looking for answers. I'm giving questions, not answers. We have a perception that there are social obligations, that there are values, there are different terms, I'll come back to that in a minute, rights, and which people owe each other in a society. There's an economic way of thinking about it, which I think has been extremely valuable, and I don't want in any way to deprecate its importance. On the other hand, I rather reluctantly come to the conclusion that many of the actions we actually take in the form of discharging our social obligations, say especially through governmental action, are not really completely explicable in the terms of the ordinary economic way of thinking. And I want to examine these questions today and what the nature of the economic way of thinking is about society, about, say, which takes the form, let's say, of policy questions, decisions of policy, and how there are elements which seem to escape this particular approach. That doesn't mean, even when it does, as we'll see, that doesn't mean that economics is irrelevant or anything like that, but it does mean the aims which society is trying to achieve are not necessarily explicable, or at least easily explicable in any economic categories. One of the questions, why do we have any sense of social values, the values to others, the values other than personal satisfaction? We seem to have a sense of the fact that we owe other people something. In a way, what I'm about to say is connected with the idea of that any considerations of ethics, of social ethics, or the obligations which are reflected in our willingness to do things for other people, and the expectations we have that other people will do them for us, are that they are that they are not obtained by a moralist reflecting. There's a lot of philosophy is full of morality derived from some sorts of principles. This is a very old preoccupation that goes back to, well, I'm sure if I say Plato, people will point out there are people well before Plato were thinking about it. Systematic understandings of concepts like justice, fairness, a sense of society. And there's a rich tradition which has continued well into the present day, the recent past, names like John Rawls or Richard Hare or Derek Parfit. So there's a whole, and it will not end with them. Economists, at least some of them, have reflected upon these issues in the past too. One interesting writer, I'll just say a few words, is the 18th century philosopher who was a bit of an economist, David Hume. I believe a Scotsman will tell me that's incorrectly pronounced, but I think that's the way most people pronounce it. David Hume is Edinburgh, has long passages about that we have social values for a practical reason, if I put it this way. Namely, there are gains from social cooperation. When people get together, they can do things they can, more than the sum of what they can do separately. He goes into some detail, he gives some examples. And this is somehow from the fact that there are these practical gains, there emerges obligations, and that's a step from going one to the other. Now, his view is that these values are basic. The desire to improve is basic. As he says, reason is the slave of the passions. In other words, it's what it is you want. Reason has to do with things like how to produce efficiently, how to cooperate with others to get more output, and things of that kind. But these are only for a purpose, and the purpose is what people really want. And ultimately, it's the creation. It's things like satisfaction, peace and quiet, adventure, whatever it is you want to consider as your aims, life, health, and so forth. One of the things that Hume raised, and it's been a source of discussion and complication ever since, was that, logically speaking, if I say you ought to do something, how do I prove it? I can only prove it from another proposition which says I ought to do something. In other words, from facts, if I say something is true, it's a fact that if we cooperate, we get together, that doesn't automatically mean we ought to cooperate. You have to have something intermediate, which is something as simple as saying, if anything benefits all of us, it's a good idea, which might be a very simple form, which you'd say is pretty non-controversial. But there is this idea that, as he puts it, is does not imply ought. These are just some basic considerations, which I will not follow up in detail, but are behind this. But I say another thing that's behind it is, and that's really implicit in this Humean thing, is that what is ethical, what the aims are the results of a lot of people. This is a democratic view of ethics. I will not go into the fact that there are a lot of problems with the idea of democracy, which is what I wrote about in my dissertation in 1951, but that's not the point I want to emphasize today. Let me just discuss some terminology, and terminology frequently has important consequences. There's a vast discussion of rights. It's an old concept, I don't know how far back it goes, people have rights. Certainly the French Revolutionary Declaration of the Rights of Man is a major document in this formulation. And I'm not sure that this is the right emphasis. In fact, I'm rather sure it's somewhat misleading. In some sense, when I have a right to something, what does that really mean? It means that somebody else has an obligation to give it to me, to help me or to facilitate it or to help me to this end. Sometimes you see the right to employment. Well, exactly what does that mean? This term has been used. I think it appears in some of the United Nations declarations. What does that mean? Who has the obligation to meet that right? So I would prefer to speak of obligation rather than rights. It's an obligation to supply whatever it is you would think we should supply, a minimum standard of living to everybody, fairness, a term which is now currently fashionable, and for good reason, by the way, is sustainability. Somehow each generation has an obligation, that's the only way I can describe it, an obligation to the future to maintain its potential for production, for supplying goods. If I'm exchanging, I'm being described something for sale or something else, I have a right to know the truth about it. That means there is an obligation, really, to tell the truth. This might be for a doctor to a patient. It might be from a financial salesman to a prospective client. It might be, well, whatever. You can think, supply many examples. There are many other examples which don't have quite the same economic flavor as these, but I'm an economist and I'll stick to them. The term rights seems to have implicit within it the idea there's an enforcement mechanism somewhere. So it's already not at the fundamental discussion, it's at the next level when you say there are obligations. The question is how these obligations are exercised and how they're enforced. Let me say a word about the way the economist approaches this, traditionally. And of course, it'd be easy to point to exceptions, but I think it's a fairly standard view. It really starts out with the concept of the market. For various reasons, I'll come back to this why. It's argued that the market is a norm. And I'm going to explain in a few minutes why there is a case here. Not by any means a conclusive case, but a case which makes this argument not ridiculous. If things can be done on the market, then they should be done on the market. This gives rise to the idea that a source of policy, a reason for policy, a reason for creating obligations, is that the markets sometimes don't work. The term market failure has become a kind of a slang, a standard terminology here. And there are various reasons why markets may not work. One is that not everything is priced very easily. Something I may do something which affects your welfare, positively or negatively, though the usual emphasis is on the negative cases, in a way which the market doesn't prevent. Or I don't have to, for example, if I want your services, they may be unpleasant, but if I pay for them, then there's no particular problem. There's a market for the labor. It may be unpleasant, but it's compensated for. A deal is made, and therefore, even though I'm imposing a burden on you, that burden is taken care of through the market. But many burdens are not taken care of through the market. There's what are called public goods, goods that make sense only if they're supplied, for everybody supplies them, and you can't exclude people. Police is the classic example, defense, fire prevention. These things on the whole are much more efficient if everybody gets them. You know, if I buy the fire services but the next door neighbor does not and his house burns down, it could have effects on me. There's a rather not at all remembered economist who coined, named Cyriaque Wanthrop, who coined a term, fugitive resources. There are resources that flow so they can't really be made properly in any easy way. And water and air, and the things that go into water and go into air, are examples of this. A stream runs through my property. Well, do I own the water? Do I own the molecules of water? They're coming from somewhere else. I don't own the molecules of water. So you begin to have to create some rules that I can take so much, and the next person can take so much. But it's not the physical water. The land is the land. It's not moving around, but the water is. Air blows, and if I put some pollutant in the air, it blows around and it affects other people. I can't follow that piece of air. I haven't bought a piece of air and follow it around, and yet I'm changing that, let's say, by burning coal or some other, or putting something else. Or in the streams, I may put a pollutant into the stream. If I'm mining, I may use chemicals which eventually go into this, either are tossed into the water or eventually go into the groundwater and eventually into other people's water. So the fugitive resources are a classic case where the market doesn't work. And it's not an accident that the economists who first wrote on this used those examples, because they work, they illustrate the point so well. Global warming, climate change, which we've all heard so much, is a sort of an extreme version of a fugitive resource. When you burn something, you produce carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide goes into the atmosphere, and it's spread all over the world within 24 hours. It's an extremely rapid fugitive resource, and it's on a global scale. Now, there are examples where markets don't exist because, for one reason or another. Okay, let me give you one simple example is when it's costly to run the market. For example, let me use a road. Now, roads are a big source of externalities. The externality is called congestion. In fact, At various times, estimates were made of the cost of congestion. They are quite large. So, well, if the road is a scarce resource, there's one way of controlling it, namely charge for the use of it. In fact, it's at least some form of that is now done in places like Singapore and London. They may be the only two places, I'm not sure. But they work pretty well in those cases, but they're not really being made property. What really should be is allow people to build roads and then charge for the use. But then, of course, roads cross each other, so what you'd have to have is a toll booth at every crossing. And the cost of running that would be perhaps something less than ideal. So you do various compromises, like saying you cross a certain boundary, you have to pay, and you may make that less costly by having monthly passes or electronic identification or something like that. But perhaps more directly and more closer to standard economics, even within commodities that we think of as fairly ordinary economic commodities, we have to recognize there's an interrelation between the present and the future. My willingness to buy things, well, first I have limited resources, so I have to think if I buy something today, I won't have funds tomorrow. So there's a question of choosing between savings, which means future consumption, and present consumption. Now, I buy the goods that I'm using today. I'm buying them on a market. I buy my clothing, I buy my food, buy my shelter. But the future food, shelter, or clothing is not available on a market. Maybe it should be. In an ideal world, it would be. But there are, of course, very good reasons why it isn't true. Closely connected with it is the fact that risks are associated, particularly with associated in the future, they're even associated with things in the present. If I go into a business, there are risks over which I have no control, for example. Now, if it's a tropical storm, if it's rain damage or wind damage, well, I can buy insurance. There is a market for that kind of risk bearing. But supposing I'm really worried about the fact that somebody's going to invent something that's going to put me out of business. You can't buy insurance against that. And there are reasons. It's not that hard to explain why, although I think a full understanding has only occurred in the last 50 years. But we know that these markets don't exist. So we know that, but a major part of economic activity is devoted to the future. Roughly we invest 20% or 15% or whatever it may be of our GNP, and that's a future orientation. And from the long run point of view, that's an extremely important part of our things. So we find that even within what you might call quite ordinary economic activities, not things like pollution, but even quite ordinary ones, markets don't always exist. And therefore, the argument is a reason which has developed in the last 50 years, been understood, is that it really has to do with information. The importance of information, well, I'm sure intuitively was always understood, really has become a central part of economic analysis only in the last 50, 60 years. And many people have contributed to this. The argument, of course, is that different people have different information. And now this has been the insurance business has had to face this issue. And they've developed, long before the economists got involved in this, they developed certain terminologies. They talk about moral hazard and about adverse selection. Moral hazard essentially means that for example, if I insure my house, I'm going to be less careful. In fact, one of the reasons I'm buying the insurance is to be less careful. But the insurance company is not in any position to know how careful I am. In fact, the term moral hazard was originally developed for a much more grosser offense, namely, you insure your house or your place of business, and then you burn it down and collect the insurance. And since it's a little hard to detect whether the fire was really set deliberately or not, this is where the term moral hazard originated, but it's been understood that even things that are much less a question of morality are nevertheless involve the same sort of thing. This comes up in health insurance very much because of the, if insured health, for example, the doctor knows that I'm insured. It says, well, there's a procedure, I'm not at all sure it'll work, but since it's free to you, why don't I recommend it? And the value, it's not really, in other words, you have to pay for it, the value, you wouldn't use it. There's much more to that story, but this isn't the place for that. And there are other elements I won't try to go into now. So essentially it has to do with the fact that if I make a deal that I'm to be paid if something happens, but only you know whether that happened and I don't, we can't make that deal. That's the simplest way of expressing the idea of asymmetric. So we know that a lot of markets don't exist. The markets for risk-bearing, because I would like to be protected. This is a commodity. Safety is a commodity like any others. And it's important. It's not only a commodity itself, but it's complementary to a lot of other commodities, like to investing in business. Now you can see this differential information cycles back to the point I made earlier, namely, is truth-telling an obligation? If I have information you don't have, am I not compelled to reveal it for you? It must be said that even if you accept the moral obligation, there's a real problem. Do I really know what information you need? It's a little more complicated, but at least that's a first step. There is, interestingly enough, another reason why some economists, and this is not true, now not all, would say there's a reason for government policy, an obligation, and that's redistribution. Now, I must say here, it's not at all clear either among economists or among people in general to what extent there's a moral right to redistribution. There's an argument that if you've done badly in the lottery of life, you ought to be compensated for it. You ought to get some protection. I'm using this kind of insurance language. You can see from the current presidential election in the United States, it's not at all clear that this is in fact a value that's widely held or widely understood. Economists, many economists, I certainly include myself, regard this as a basic requirement. But regardless of what your attitude toward it is a question, in what form do you redistribute? Let's suppose you accept that somehow, and the fact is, as I will argue, everybody, in spite of the language, in spite of all the rhetoric, there are certain kinds of redistribution that everybody accepts. I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. In spite of the fact that if you put it in terms of taking from the rich and giving to the poor, people raise their hands in horror, at least in the United States they do. Supposing we accept there's some kind of redistribution. Then a market-oriented person says, well, okay, the poor people are poor because their purchasing power is low. Give them more purchasing power. Don't tell them what to do, because they know, the market says they are the ones responsible for deciding what to do with it. So we'd say that all redistribution should be in cash. There are complications, there are many complications, I don't want to go into the here now, which say it isn't always true, even on that, but rather oddly, in fact, if you look at what redistribution does take place, and a considerable amount does, even in the United States, it's almost always specific. Both occur, but that's it's in particular goods. At some points, food would have been an object of redistribution. You find historically, in periods, and say in British history, when there was a famine, the local justice of the peace would insist on some kind of compensation, some kind of provision of food. Food, of course, in the developed world is not an issue really, at least in terms of survival. Housing, 50 years ago, housing policies were very widespread in Great Britain and to some extent in the United States. Now, they still exist. Even in the United States, they still exist, though they're assuming lower proportions. But one commodity that's certainly redistributed in kind and not in money is medical care. That's true in every country, not excluding the United States. And this kind of expenditures are have been talked about by some economists. James Tobin, the great economist from Yale, late James Tobin, talked about specific egalitarianism. There was a tendency toward wanting egalitarianism in particular commodities, equal housing, equal, or not equal, but at least not too much inequality in housing or medical care. At the time, I sort of thought, oh, this is ridiculous, because it doesn't give you any theoretical basis for deciding which commodities. Why are some and not the others? There was no criterion. But I'm afraid I think he was right, and even though I was correct in saying that you still need an argument as to why these, I think he was correct in saying we do have these strong tendencies as becoming perfectly obvious in the medical care situation. Let me give you a few words as to why this economic view is justified. I've given you a certain point of view, and now I say why. Well, one idea, why do we rely on the market and only fill in exceptions? Only worry when the market fails. Well, there are two ways of putting it. I think the general economist's point of view is people and businesses know what's best for them. It's a question of distributed knowledge. People, if you want to help me, I know what's best for me. Just give me the money and let me do it. And the market is a way of my deciding how the resources. And the reason is I know best about what's good for me, what I like, what satisfies me. A liberal point of view, which is a little different from the economic point of view, is people should get what they want, whether or not it's good for them. This is a different position. This is at least the same conclusion, but it's a somewhat logically different position. Now, the general principle which has governed a branch of economics called welfare economics has been roughly this. There are three factors: knowledge, the bearing of the consequences, and the power to make decisions. That efficiency is achieved when these three are located together. There's the person who knows best and who bears the consequence. If I buy goods, I benefit or suffer according to my decisions. So this gives me a strong impulse to be correct, at least correct as I judge it. And if I'm given the decision, then I'm joining it. Now, you already see the problem that knowledge, for example, might be different from bearing of consequences. If you have something, and this occurs, say, in medical practice, I don't seriously expect that I'm sick. I don't seriously figure that I know best what to do. So now I already have a problem, what's known as a principal agent problem in economics, that I have to rely on somebody else because I know that that other person knows more than I do. So you already see the complications arise. But the general market principle is that this is the situation in which markets run best. And the argument is that in a certain technical sense, the market, if that condition is satisfied, that those three factors are indeed located together, then the outcomes are efficient. And so on the average, people's willingness, ability are great. Okay, that's the argument for the market. So we understand that if the market fails, we do the best we can and make it as close to a market-like situation. So we have global warming. Economists say, okay, what you want to do is put a price. The market doesn't put a price on this bad, the emission of carbon dioxide. So let's put a price. Let's put a tax on it, or have a transferable permit or something, in which we get the same effect as if there were a tax. And it has the advantage that you don't need too much information. People know best, and preserves efficiency in that sense. Let me give a couple of questions about actual public policy, and let's see how they fit in. One is something I happen to have been involved in for reasons I won't go into here. Anti-malarial drugs. It's getting from a very general thing to a very specific. Say malaria is a disease which kills somewhere, the statistics are very bad, by the way, so any numbers are not very good, but it kills the order of 1 million to 1.5 million people a year. Almost all children, by the way. Adults usually survive. Well, they maybe get very sick, but they usually survive. It's about 1 million, 1.5 million per year. Probably about 500 million people a year get an attack of malaria. Though the bulk of them survive, but they're sick, they're out of work for a while. It's not a pleasant situation. It's concentrated, the deadly kind of malaria, anyway, there's several kinds of malaria, but the deadly kind is concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa and in Southeast Asia. Countries like Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, and in Africa, south of the Sahara Desert. For various reasons, there is a drug that has been used, or there are several drugs, I should say, that have been used, have been supplied by the market, for the most part, at something like 10 cents a dose. Well, none of these drugs are perfectly effective, but they can reduce the death rates quite a bit. They're not guarantees. However, resistance has developed to these drugs, so they're essentially useless now. There is an effect, by a rather romantic story, which I won't try to with by sheer chance, more or less. Drugs have been developed in China, as a matter of fact, they're developed in this country, which, on the basis of some very old herbal texts, called artemisinin. It's from a form of a drug that's known, a plant that's known in the West as wormwood, and the Latin name is Artemisia. One particular species, well, there are 30 species, only one species produces an effective drug. The rest, which are used for flavoring vermouth, are not of no use. But this drug was known, was identified in the 3rd century A.D. Okay, there's only one problem with it. It costs about $2 a dose at the factory door. Now, by most standards, you say this is a very inexpensive drug. However, there's one characteristic about malaria. Only poor people get it. As to say, today, it wasn't always true, by the way, but it has been eliminated from temperate zones. It did exist. I mean, you have the 19th century had malaria epidemics even in the northern part of the United States, and Great Britain had epidemics too. However, they could eliminate, essentially by eliminating the mosquitoes, you can eliminate the malaria. That doesn't work in the tropics because when it's hot enough, the mosquitoes breed so rapidly that you cannot eliminate them. It has to do with the physiology of the mosquito, which is the carrier of the malaria parasite. So you can have these drugs at $2 a treatment. You'd have to have them distributed by some local distribution system. In fact, the previous drug, the chloroquine, was distributed from the price at which it was landed in the country. It was like another 5 cents per dose. And it was sold. It was a triumph of the free market, you know, you say. It was absolutely, the trouble is at $2 a dose, plus whatever the markup is, this is very expensive in countries where the per capita income is of $1,000 a year. The Thai, which is, of course, a much more prosperous country, relatively speaking, it's still a poor country, but much above this level, is doing a very successful job of anti-malarial control. Vietnam is doing quite a successful job. They are using these new drugs. But in most of sub-Saharan Africa, with per capita incomes less than $1,000 a per year, this becomes very expensive. Now, what should we do? Put it on the market, charge $3, $4, whatever it comes down to, $4 a dose. It's on the market now. It's like $8 or $10 a dose, by the way, and sold to wealthy people. But let's say that it could be brought down to, by encouraging competition or whatnot to $3 or $4 a dose. The drug producers are selling it at $2, by the way. In fact, these are large drug companies which have really doing this as a public service. They're not trying to make money at this. There's probably no money to be made, and they're doing it, making a gesture. But so it's not the drug companies that are the question; it's the intermediaries. And what should we do? We know that if $2 a dose or more at the factory door, if you pass it all on, the usage is going to be greatly restricted. Should we, what, they say, well, let the market work, right? Or, okay, let's give people $5 or $6 a year extra, a redistribution. Will it go for malaria, for anti-malarial drugs? I'm leaving it as a question. I'll come back to that. Another quite different matter is let's look at the budgets of the developed countries. What are they spending their money on? Are they repairing market failures? Is that where the money's going? Yeah, we have big defense budgets. We have police budgets. We have prisons. Prisons in the United States are a big item. But turns out, if you look at where the most of the money spent by the government at all levels, state, local, and federal, there are three big items: education at all levels, retirement, what the United States we call Social Security, and health care. This is what Richard Musgrave many years ago called this category merit goods. And again, it was one of these things I thought, fine, he's labeling these things, but what kind of a theory is? Well, I still don't know what the theory is, but the label is probably correct. These are somehow different. Just to give you an idea of some figures, this is from the year 2003, gross national product in the United States, to give you a reference point, is $11 trillion. Education, public expenditure on education, all levels, was about $700 billion. The retirement was a little more than that. Public expenditures were like $900 billion. In other words, the expenditures on those three items are 21% of the gross national product and 2/3 of all public expenditures. 2/3 of all public expenditures. The public expenditures can be thought of as a way by which the people are discharging their obligations. It turns out, what do they think their big obligations are? These three. In fact, the private sector people are individually spending money on these goods too. It's about something like half as much as the public expenditures. So the merit goods are 2/3 of all public expenditures. Now, well, okay, we have these categories: market failure, public goods. Does this explain it? Well, if you take almost anything that's spent, you can always find a public goods aspect. There's some market failure somewhere, but that's not really enough. You've got to be a substantial amount. Let's go to the anti-malarials. The fact is, nobody who thinks about this has the slightest doubt that we should subsidize. I mean, you're not going to let any economic arguments interfere with the obvious conclusion that this has got to be subsidized. There is a question of how there are a lot of technical questions as to how you subsidize, because subsidies do have complicated reasons, but that's not I don't want to take that up here. So it's quite clear that we have just no question in our mind. We want to get this to the people at something, not to pay the factory price, essentially. Have it all absorbed. Let's turn to these public expenditure items. Retirement. Well, who's the beneficiary of retirement? The person who's retired. There's no externality there at all. Now, you can say there are market failures in this sense. How do I provide for my retirement? There's a problem there. Because essentially, if I buy annuities, there are imperfections in the annuity market. There's adverse selection, essentially. If people know their own health and can estimate their longevity better than the insurance company can. And in fact, people who buy annuity privately live about 3 years longer than people who don't. And the expectation, somehow they know they're healthier on the average. So you may have to have some kind of intervention, but in fact, the retirement schemes always have a redistributive element in them. Healthcare. Well, there are some small public goods aspects to healthcare, some externalities, but these are a very minor part of the expenditures. They used to be important, but what's happened is the other costs have gone up much more. Immunization is a public expenditure. Sanitation. But these are not the major expenditures. The bulk of medical expenditures are just to cure you. There's no externality again. Now, there is a problem that in the case of health, it's a very random event. I mean, longevity is also a random event, but not quite to the same extent. Health is a very random event. Most of the health expenditures go to a fairly small number of people. It's just that you don't know who they are, so you take out insurance. Just as I've been spending for 40 or 50 years, I was paying insurance on my house against wind and water damage and never collected a penny, but that's all right. The risk was there. But here then, asymmetric information becomes extremely important. It is not easy to have health insurance, I've already alluded to that, have health insurance plans for all sorts of reasons, but one of the main ones is that if you have unless the health insurance company starts managing the health care, which is what has emerged in the United States, they're going to be at the mercy of the doctor. If they do, then you have bureaucratic interference. And the people, there's a lot of talk in the United States about the government shouldn't stand in the way. But of course, if you didn't, the insurance company would have or the health maintenance organization would have exactly the same, and indeed, complaints about that are legion. So still we can imagine a public insurance system. It's pretty clear in the health case, even more in the retirement case, that the impulse to redistribute plays a role. There's some view, somehow, that nobody should be deprived of health care because they're poor. And the fact is, with all the talk about the market and so on, practically no one in the United States really seriously advocating depriving somebody of health care because they'll make it unpleasant, they'll do all sorts of things, but there's a way about it. I suppose you'll find some conservative intellectuals who will think this is wrong, but I doubt any politician would seriously face the public, which means it's a publicly held value. In a way, the most puzzling one of all is education. Education, you can argue about the externalities in education, but I'm sure whatever they are, they're exhausted by the elementary school level. There may be an argument that a country where there are a lot of illiterate people means the literate people have less value. But surely that's a matter of elementary education. There have been some econometric studies. For whatever they're worth, they tend to show that differences in high school education go primarily to almost exclusively to the recipient, the person who gets the education. That the rate of return is a private rate of return. Econometrics in this case is a lot of tricky questions, but for whatever it's worth. Certainly when it comes to higher education, it's very hard to argue that they aren't good. Now, however, education has the same problem as other investments. The payoff is over a long period of time. So if the student, if you assume there's some conflict of interest between parents and students, or if you assume the parents have limited capacity, are poor, then there's a very good argument for saying that we don't want that to be a barrier. So we need to set up a credit market to manage. So the problem is not the education itself, which is clearly a private good, but the complementary good, which is the credit market. Well, there are all sorts of answers. the income of the individual, after all, is pretty risky. On the average, college pays very nicely. It doesn't mean it pays in every single case. Although, for example, Milton Friedman gave an answer, which I find very attractive, actually. I don't always agree, I happen to agree with him on a lot of things. Namely, it should be paid for on an income-related basis. Essentially, modify the tax system a little bit so if you've got a benefit of college education. Nevertheless, this is not done. And that's an interesting question, why this is done. Well, I've said I'm posing questions. Why is it, I still don't know quite how we rationalize these particular benefits. It's clear, somehow the idea of giving people education is accepted as a form of redistribution, which is okay, whereas giving the money is not okay. Why? I don't know the answer to that question. There are many other examples, by the way, of social obligations of different kind. For example, the obligations of parents to children. Now, ordinarily, we feel that parents have such a vested interest in children, this problem doesn't arise. But it does arise in a significant minority of the cases. Once was hearing somebody talk about the relation between child abuse as a child, and depression as an adult. And I wasn't paying too much attention, so I thought he said something like 10% of children are abused. I thought he was talking about the United States. It turned out he was talking about New Zealand, which you think it was an ideal community. In fact, and the figure in the United States, the figure, as far as I could check in the United States, was roughly the same. As is reported, this is a lot of problems with these numbers because this is what's reported. These are reported figures, and they may be underestimates or not. But whatever it is, there's a significant amount of conflict between children, and since the child is special. And of course, one last obligation, which I mentioned briefly at the beginning, I just want to remind you of, is the obligation of future generations. Here, the word obligation seems absolutely right. To say that the future generations have a right when they're not even here is somehow stretching the term right. So it's clear we have an obligation, and in some form we always act on it, by the way. Anything which preserves the nation, like a war, is pretty much an idea you're considering the continuity of the country. Public works, particularly long-lasting public works like dams, things like that, already illustrate that. Now, of course, we're talking about climate change. We're talking about nuclear waste disposal. We're talking about things with consequences for very long periods of time. We haven't been accustomed quite. In fact, the champion is not climate change, but nuclear waste disposal in terms of time. The requirement in the United States, official requirement in the United States for, I think it's in legislation actually, for a nuclear waste disposal facility is that there should be no significant leakage of the nuclear waste into the underground water system for 10,000 years. I don't know anything else which has quite that long proceeding. Now, what I'm getting at is that, and I think I have talked more than I should have, is raising this question: can we get some idea of? We do in fact perceive a number of obligations to others. Obligations which sometimes even contradict values that we seem to espouse, like the free markets and all that. And yet, we espouse these things, we accept them. There are many other examples of professional ethics, which I haven't gone into at all. There are many examples in which we have these obligations. Some of them you can define, they're efficiency creating. I think professional ethics can be defended on that ground. Some of these cannot be easily understood on those bases. And I think we have to recognize, and economists have not recognized officially, of course in practice they have to, that there are these set of obligations. It doesn't mean that economics is useless, because once you agree that you should supply education, you still have the question of supplying it efficiently, and there are all sorts of questions of this kind which are very important in subject research. But I'll leave you with these conundrums, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Professor Arrow, for sharing with us your words of wisdom. Professor Arrow has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. May I now invite Professor Lawrence Lau to conduct the question and answer session. Professor Lau, please. If you would like to raise any questions, please raise your hand, and our staff will pass a microphone to you. There is also a microphone in the balcony for taking questions.
Let us give Professor Arrow another big hand for a wonderful speech. We can now take questions from the floor. The ground rules are you identify yourself. Please, Sir James.
I'm Jim Merles, and I'm another theoretical economist. But I'd say thank you. It's very nice to get a lecture that's stimulating. And I was trying to think if there was anything I disagreed with. But let me try the following idea. Thinking about how strong a force the obligation towards equality might be, that's specific. I suddenly thought, is it not plausible that people find another principle more appealing, the idea to each according to his needs? And I think there are interesting differences between the idea of things going to people according to their needs and the idea of equality. And you rightly spent quite a bit of the lecture talking about education. And that seemed to me a very interesting example. We look at education where distribution is certainly not equal. And it seemed to me that you could plausibly argue that the basis of this was in need. I remember our friend Frank Hahn once hammering the desk saying, need is not an economic concept. And I think that's probably right, but that doesn't mean it's not relevant. And the particular sense of need that I want to suggest education might be doing, expressing a social obligation. Well, you might think it's a social obligation to inform people. It's plausible. I think it's a social obligation to explain that because people don't choose perfectly, that's one of the points you're making. I think we all recognize that it's important to do something about that, and the major thing that we socially and publicly do about it is education.
I think your point is, let me say, first of all, I think that argument can be made very strongly for elementary and possibly even secondary education. I'm less clear that one could describe higher education as a need in the same sense. Higher education, well, even apart from the economic value of higher education, there is a question of what you might call the satisfaction, the desire to know. It's a satisfaction of the individual's desire to know more about the world, to become cultured, to become, to develop a broader perspective on the world. But it seems more like a consumption good of a somewhat luxurious nature than a need. The primary and maybe even the secondary education can be defended that way. Medicine, of course, would fit your description, I think, best of all. I wonder, presumably the reason why food is not such a strong focus of attention is that in the developed countries there's enough food around. Now that does raise a question about less developed countries, whether we regard food as a need, because you might think as a rhetoric needs, one could argue that this food. Now, one argument, of course, on Frank Hahn's side, is that if you have to have food, you're going to want food. And therefore, you don't really have to think of it as something to be imposed. If I need food, it's also that if I got $1, I'm going to use it for food. I don't need a special policy with regard to it. So this is the problem. There's one piece of history I've been trying to check, and unsuccessfully so far. When the Irish had their great famine in 1846, Ireland was an integral part of Great Britain. There was no legally, it was a part. Simply, there was not a separate legal entity in any sense of the word. Was there no perception on the part of the English that they should have said, here is a need by any definition one could think of? And I've asked a couple of people who are experts in the field, none of them seem to know what the English had. It wasn't their private charity, for example. Were people raising money? Were sending food? Evidently, the government did not intervene. That seems to be quite clear from every account. They did not say, well, these people are hungry. So there's an interesting whether, has the world changed with regard to the evaluation of needs? After all, this was, by the standards of that day, is a pretty prosperous country. We're not, Great Britain was in quite a good, if there's any country that could have done something, it was Great Britain. And I'm puzzled about that, whether, you see, as I say, one can easily argue that food, the reason we don't see food, even though it's a need, is because it simply is not a problem. And that housing is considerably diminished compared, and it seems to me the evolution of housing is such that most people are housed, and council housing is not the issue that would have been 50 years ago, and the corresponding, the United States never went as far, but we did have extensive programs. We still have some, but they're diminishing in importance. It could be argued, well, prosperity is sort of taking care of that. But the medical care fits your scheme most, because you say the people need it, in health. The question is why the government couldn't provide some kind of insurance policy and let things alone. May be very tricky. But it is clear there's a redistributive element. The United States can, since you have a universal system, you can't quite see these problems. We can, by our complicated system, we can see how different parts are treated differently. For some reason, retired people are treated as privileged. And I'm a beneficiary of Medicare, even though I'm certainly on a relatively, I'm certainly well above average income. But we do have a program for people who are in their working ages. And interestingly enough, it's a very popular program. No Republican governors, it happens to have a state component. The individual states participate. It's like 50% financed by the federal government. The Republican governors make no effort to reduce the amount of Medicaid. That's the name of the program. There's no essential, there's no evidence that the ideology against redistribution has any effect. So this is being treated as a specific redistribution. And okay, your point is well taken, but now the question is, what do we have to, it pushes the problem one step back. What is a need, as opposed to what people desire?
Maybe I can ask one question, Ken. Following up on this idea of social obligation, I'm thinking about supporting old people. In the Chinese society, it's really a cultural thing. In Chinese society, the tradition is that the children would have an obligation to support the parents. Now, that's not a social obligation. That's, in some sense, a private obligation. But when you have, let's say, people who don't have children, or the children would not support them, and so forth, I think there is generally, speaking, there is society feels there's a social obligation to support the older generation. Now, would that fit under your definition?
No, yes. I mean, by social obligation, I mean really an obligation to other people. And it might be discharged through a collectivity which is very widespread. It might be discharged, but all I mean is an obligation to other people. I mentioned the obligation of parents to children, and that would also be the converse. Yeah, now it's interesting, one thing, let me just throw as a curious observation. The religious texts that I am aware of are full of injunctions to honor your father and your mother, and so forth. I've never seen an injunction to take care of your children. Now, why is that? Okay, there's an optimistic, in other words, there is the idea of an obligation to take care of older people. So, by the way, it's not true today, but that's true because of government. There's no question. It differed very much in the United States by ethnic groups. There were certain immigrant ethnic groups where the obligation was very strong. There were others there are other groups, particularly the more assimilated Americans had less of an obligation than most. It was the immigrant groups that tended to have more of an obligation than than Native Americans, who tended to leave their parents, get away from their parents as fast as possible. But there were certainly a lot of that. I mean, I can remember before the institution, the worries about grandparents was standard. Now, why is it that we don't see injunctions on parents to help children? The optimistic argument, of course, is that most parents care about their children and it's unnecessary. And maybe that's a better explanation, which suggests that caring for your parents is not quite as natural as caring for your children.
Okay, last question. Anybody? Yeah, please, Michael.
Professor Arrow, I think that all of us would agree that this is a very interesting and exciting time in terms of economic cycles. In other words, the financial turmoil that the world is now facing. In terms of obligations on the part of governments, do you think that, take for example the US government, do you think that the US government has fulfilled its obligations in terms of its economic responsibilities? And what's your comments on the measures which the US government has taken so far? And are there any other things that the government should and can do more about contributing to an early economic recovery of the economy?
Well, let me I could take refuge in saying, after all, I'm a theorist, what do I know about these things? But I'll offer some kind of an answer. There are several aspects of the current situation that have to be distinguished. One is the general question of a recession, I'm not getting technical about what the word recession means, but a slowing down of economic activity. That was perceived well before this current financial crisis. Remember, the government already took steps, I think very inadequate steps, but did take steps to, by giving tax rebates to stimulate spending. So the recession question is on top of this financial crisis has come upon us. Like most financial crises, come very suddenly. Essentially, if they were predicted, they probably wouldn't happen, because people would have taken steps to reduce their exposures and so forth, so that it would be mitigated. And so the quality of all financial crises, their relative unexpectedness. I'm not sure I can fault on the financial crisis side. I don't think I can fault the government really. Sure, it's not ideal, but it's never going to be ideal. There's a lot of uncertainty. Intervening when you don't need to can be quite bad. So there's always a chance of making a mistake. I think the particular proposals they made at the beginning, the proposals have evolved, were not very good. In fact, they were very vague. They're not at all clear. And that in itself was a bad thing, because if you want reassurance, you want to be specific. The British actually came out with although they were slower, came out with what is clearly a better plan. And the Americans, of course, are moving in the same direction as the British proposals. Given the complexity of the matter, I'm not sure that I think I think this is rather bolder than we had any right to expect. So I don't want to be critical. I'm critical of a lot of, there are lots of problems about details, but those are the matters that people can argue about and legitimately argue about. I think we were slow in hitting in the anti-recession policy. And people said this was not exactly unknown. I mean, perfectly reputable economists were saying that the original steps were taken last, January or February, whenever it was, were inadequate. For example, we should have increased unemployment insurance benefits, because if there's one thing, if you want to stimulate consumption, that's it. Tax rebates are an iffy matter. In fact, they're more iffy now, because it's clear that since people have lost a lot of wealth, the first thing I'm going to do with a tax rebate is put it in the savings account or use it to build up my wealth again. So I think the argument that it's going to be, that at this stage tax rebates are a good idea. People who really want to spend money, are spending everything at their poor end because they've lost their jobs, I think those are the people who are going to spend more money. But I'm not sure this is a moral question. I think this is more a technical question of what is an efficient policy. To be fair about it, although certainly the general thrust of this administration has been very much on a, don't interfere with the market line. I think in this case, their arguments are more, what is it that there's a difference of opinion as to what it works. I think they should have done more, and I think now it's very important we do more on the anti-recession side, a lot more. There's lots of things happening. I could give you a shopping list. For example, the problem about, since we have a federal system of government, one problem is that the states have to cut back on their spending because their tax revenues are coming back. Well, the federal government should, in effect, finance bridges and highways and school buildings or whatever, which are needed anyway, by the way. I mean, they're perfectly good investments. The government should be planning a massive, that would increase get a lot of spending. So I believe that we're doing quite an inadequate job on the anti-recession front. I'm not so, at the moment I'm not, it remains to be seen how it's going to play out, but at the moment I'm not too unhappy about the financial crisis.
Thank you very much, Professor Arrow. Let us give Professor Arrow another big hand. Thank you very much.